Peter and Jenny. Well, I actually came across Peter Marsden, who was a fellow, a long time ago. He doesn't remember me, but I remember him when I started working at the Museum of London in 1984. Peter sort of lurked behind the door of a corridor. It was called, was it DUA Field Section 2? Two, that's right, yes. Yes, that's right. Peter's worked in the City of London since the 1960s and pioneered excavations on Roman and Saxon medieval London. But also, as part of that, became involved in discovering and studying Roman and medieval shipwrecks in the Thames. And following on from that, you've worked on the Dover boat, Mary Rose amongst others, and he's a well-known expert on nautical archaeology and boats, ancient boats in particular. Jenny is the author of the book Destiny Defined, Dante, Gabrielle, Rossetti, and Elizabeth Siddal in Hastings. And we have a book here, we have books down the front there for you to look at and hopefully purchase later on. But Peter and Jenny live at 5 High Street, Hastings, the former home or retreat of mayors, town gunners, merchants, smugglers, and at various times Rossetti and Siddal. So see, Rossetti's in good company there. Together, Peter and Jenny use archaeological finds, archives, and local museums to uncover details about the lives of their home's former inhabitants. And also, thanks to Jenny's research and advocacy, Elizabeth Siddal's name has been added to the blue plaque commemorating Rossetti's time at the house. So, enough of me burbling on, I will hand over to Peter and Jenny and let them talk to you about it.
Thank you. Thank you, John. It's a far cry from shipwrecks to the Pre-Raphaelites, I can tell you, but to put an archaeologist and a historian into an old house, well, it's an absolute gift. You have to delve into the history and then to delve into the ground and find the history that's buried there as well. So that was great fun. What John mentioning, assemble outside with the statue of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the young men of the Pre-Raphaelites called him Sir Sloshua. They didn't really approve too much of his style of art. Anyway, we now live in Devon, but we went to, we bought the house at 5 High Street with a blue plaque on there, knowing very little about its history at all. And we delved into the history, and it was an incredible voyage of discovery. And it's not just about the Pre-Raphaelites at all. They're just one segment, but a very fascinating one, because it's all about the romance between these two young people who eventually came back to Hastings years later and got married. Hastings is the old town of Hastings is quite different from the rest of Hastings, the Victorian. It's nestling in a narrow valley leading down to the sea, to the English Channel, in East Sussex. And the number 5 is where the little arrow is here. It's sort of round about there, beside the high street of the town. And that's the house. That's it as it is now. It's been refronted since the war, which is a great pity. There was no record made of what's behind this facade, and it looks like bricks, but actually they're tiles. And but behind all there is the house, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. And it's in there that we delved not only behind boarding and to find old wallpaper, finding what the house was like in 1854 and earlier, but also taking up floorboards and finding out what was under there. And it was just incredible. And there's so much more that people in the future will find, but it was an amazing voyage of discovery. The blue plaque there refers, as John mentioned, to Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti, and really Elizabeth Siddal has been added to the blue plaque because she's an important person in her own right for various reasons that Jenny Ridd, my wife, will tell you that part of the story, and then I'll pick up later on some of the archaeology. So Jenny, it's over to you.
Hello. Can you all hear me at the back? Yes? Good. Okay, so you're going to do my slides for me, aren't you? Okay, that's better. So, 5 High Street has an unusual amount of extant documentation. The local records in Hastings, Hastings Museum particularly, were very plentiful, and there was more to be found in the East Sussex Record Office in Lewes. So, amazingly, the deeds on 5 High Street exist in a continuous run since 1620, which for an ordinary little house is quite incredible. You'll expect it of a stately home, but not an ordinary little house. We also had an oral source, a lady who had actually lived there 50 years before, and her father had lived there before her. And then there was Violet Hunt, the lady that you see in the picture here. Violet Hunt was a socialite, and she was a friend of Ford Madox Ford, a writer of the time, and they had a long and difficult love affair, mainly because he was already married to someone else. In 1932, Violet Hunt wrote a book called The Wife of Rosetti, which she wrote it when she was in the last stages of syphilis and somewhat mentally impaired. Unfortunately, that's what syphilis does in its last stage. And so the style of her book is garrulous, flowery, sometimes impossible to interpret, and for this reason she actually wasn't taken seriously by the academics and by modern scholars of Pre-Raphaelites. However, in her defence, her references to number 5 were for the most part accurate and do actually add to our understanding of the Rossetti and Siddal story and their stay there. This photo of the house, you saw in Peter's slide what it looks like today. This is what it looked like in Violet Hunt's day, 1832, and we believe it was fairly unchanged from Rossetti and Siddal's day in 1854. So you see it's a rather different looking house and it's been gentrified. It's my contention that the importance of It's my contention that the importance of Hastings in the Rossetti-Siddal story has been underplayed, being previously dismissed because of lack of information. Peter and I would very much like to attempt to put that right and to give this seemingly ordinary but actually very extraordinary house, 5 High Street, Hastings, its rightful place in the Pre-Raphaelites sphere. So, having set the stage, I'd now like to introduce the players. Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti was born on the 12th of May 1828 to an Italian father, Gabrielle, so that's Gabrielle with an E on it, and a half-Italian mother, Frances Polidori. Gabriel's siblings were Maria and Francesca, William, and the one that we all remember, of course, the poet Christina. The children were well educated and shared a love of art, drama, poetry, and literature. In 1845, Gabriel was at the Royal Academy next door, where he met up with William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais. All 3 were young men, disliked the Royal Academy and left it, and despised what art had become. They considered it chocolate boxy and twee, and were very disrespectful of Sir Joshua Reynolds. Peter stole my line here by telling you they called him Sir Joshua. Presumably because they felt he sloshed the paint on, and they had a different approach entirely. The three men, and they were young, 19, 20 and 21, started a new movement called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or PRB, in order to reform art. They actually not only reformed it, but they changed it forever. These young men needed young female models, whom they dubbed stunners. Enter Elizabeth Siddal, who was discovered working in a milliner's off Leicester Street. Her father was a cutler, and her family not comfortably off, so there was an immediate class barrier. But when Gabriel and Lizzie met, he felt, in his own words, his destiny was defined. She soon rose to supermodel status and was sitting for other male artists. Her long copper hair was the appeal, with her tall appearance and the certainty that she would transfer well onto canvas. By 1854, Gabriel and Lizzie were an item. They were in love, and they were in love with love. And Lizzie had given up millinery for modelling. It was more lucrative. However, Lizzie's health had a huge problem. She had some undiagnosed condition, which people think today could possibly have been anorexia, but nobody is entirely sure. The same year, 3 of Gabriel and Lizzie's feminist friends were all convinced that Lizzie was dying. They were Barbara Lee Smith, Bessie Parks, and Anna Mary Hammett, and all 3 of them lived partly in London and partly in Hastings. The women pooled their knowledge of Hastings and were adamant that Lizzie should take a break there. The Rossetti family knew Hastings, as did Holman Hunt and Millais, who had visited with Edward Lear in 1852. For Christina, it was her most favourite place, and she spent a fair amount of time there recuperating from various illnesses herself. In April of 1854, Barbara Lee Smith wrote from London to Bessie Parks in Hastings, "Will you, dear, see if there is a room, see if the room Vanessa had by St Clement's Church is to let. If not, will you ask Mrs. Elphick where there is a room with sun and a good woman for a few shillings a week, say 7 or 8 or less if possible." Can you imagine getting a room for 7 or 8 shillings nowadays? "It must be enough to do for drawing, eating and sleeping." And so it was that Lizzie and Gabriel came to lodge at 5 High Street, where the landlady was Mrs. Elphick, and I'll come back to her in a minute. Further research told me that the Vanessa referred to by Barbara Lee Smith was Sarah Vanessa, then pronounced Venus. And she was in fact a neighbour of Barbara's and Bessie's in Pelham Crescent, which was a beautiful Georgian crescent built into the rock under Hastings Castle, if any of you know Hastings, along the seafront. And it's been beautifully restored, all except for one house, which hasn't been painted. Bessie was at number 6, Barbara was at number 9, and the Vanessa family at number 10. George and Hannah Vanessa had 10 children, of whom Sarah was the 4th daughter. Her father George was a carpenter down at Post Office Passage, just a few doors from 5 High Street. Hastings was a small town, and so everybody knew everybody else. And in 1998, we were lucky enough to be invited to the unveiling of the blue plaque on Barbara's house at 9 Pelham Crescent. Barbara was a prominent writer, an artist, co-founder of Girton College, Cambridge, and later a suffragette. She did all this as the illegitimate daughter of Ben Smith, an MP, and Anne Longden, whom he never married. Barbara was unconventional, feisty, talented, and nothing held her back. She was a true feminist and left off her corsets. So Barbara Lee Smith knew the landlady at number 5 because she knew Sarah Vaness, Mrs. Elphick's servant, and so was able to fix up Lizzie and Gabriel to stay there very cheaply. Mrs. Elphick was born Mary Henley in 1790, making her 64 in 1854. She was married to John Elphick at All Saints' Church in the next road to number 5. John, born in 1793, had been a boat builder, but had become ill, too ill to work, and so they rented number 5 in order for Mary to run a lodging house there and at the same time be able to care for him. We discovered that the Elphicks were buried in All Saints' Churchyard, and a friend supplied a hand-drawn plan of a community mapping exercise showing the exact position of the grave. So we found it, we located it in the churchyard under a lot of vegetation, layers and layers of vegetation which we had to strip away. But we heaved the stone upright and triumphantly read the Elphick's name on it. John had died in 1857, so 3 years after the Rossetti visit, but Mary had survived him by another 20 years. So we obtained permission from the rector to re-erect the stone. We had to cement it in for safety purposes, but afterwards we did feel that we'd added a vital part to the story of Lizzie's visit to Hastings and ensured that the Elphick and Vaness families took their rightful place within the Pre-Raphaelite context, especially as there are still descendants of the Vaness family in Hastings today. Okay. Lizzie and Gabriel arrived at 5 High Street on the 22nd of April 1854 and were greeted by Mrs. Elphick. Gabriel hastily dashed back to London to see his father, who was dying, and Bessie Parks visited Lizzie in Hastings. It seems that Anna Mary Hammett must have visited Lizzie as well, because it was she who recommended her homeopathic doctor, Dr. Wilkinson. But it is Violet Hunt who tells the story of Lizzie's visit to Dr. Wilkinson, and she tells us that in fact Dr. Wilkinson passed Lizzie on to a Dr. Hales. And sure enough, when we did the research in the Hastings records, we found a Dr. Hale. So Violet Hunt was checking out once again. And Dr. Hale lived at a very glamorous house on the seafront at 26 Grand Parade in St. Leonard's. Unfortunately, we couldn't find that slide for you. But he had advertised in, I haven't got a date, but he had advertised recently in a local newspaper that he had opened a new dispensary at number 8 High Street. This is number 8 you're seeing on the screen. And of course that was only 3 doors down from Lizzie, and so very, very convenient for her to visit. Just to add a note about Anna Mary Hammett, she was a painter, and she actually was completely demolished by John Ruskin's criticism of her. He had a way with doing this with women, I'm afraid, John Ruskin. And as a result, Anna Mary Hammett had a nervous breakdown and never painted again. But it is her parents you are more likely to remember. They were authors, poets. Do you remember the line, "Will you walk into my parlour?" said the spider to the female. Bet you all remember that from childhood. Well, they were responsible. The stay at 5 High Street, Hastings, can be considered as the halcyon days for Gabriel and Lizzie. They were in the first flush of love, and things were never quite as good again. This, of course, to me anyway, gives number 5 a very special place in their story. It all happened here. Gabriel continued to pop up and down from London to visit Lizzie. His father had died, so the pressure was off him, and finally he came to stay at 5 High Street also. On one occasion they decided to sit together in Lizzie's room whilst he drew her. Mrs. Elphick was cheerfully casual about the whole idea of chaperoning. That wasn't necessary. And actually, Lizzie had long since compromised her reputation anyway in those days as a model to Gabriel. Gabriel never took his paints to Hastings, but instead, this besotted young man drew Lizzie simply and endearingly, portraying her frailty and her vulnerability through a variety of positions, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, and sometimes reading or resting. He captured her very essence on paper and unknowingly provided art historians with a heritage of unrivaled quality. These drawings were some of Gabriel's finest, not for their technicality, but for the refinement and the intensity engendered in them. And once again, folks, it happened at 5 High Street. I mentioned that Gabriel's father, I never know whether to call him Gabriel or Gabriel, and I always end up calling him Gabriel because it's so like Gabrielle. But by this time, Gabrielle had died. On Tuesday, May the 9th, Gabriel wrote a letter from 5 High Street to Bessie Parks in London on black-edged notepaper, explaining that since he'd last seen Bessie, his father had died. Gabrielle had actually died on the 26th of April. He also mentioned that he didn't feel that Lizzie's health had worsened. He wrote from number 5 to his brother William and his poet friend, William Allingham. On the 17th of May, he wrote to his brother suggesting that William should pawn a tie-pin and send the proceeds to him quickly. Tin is no more, he described it. Tin is no more. So Gabriel was running out of money. Remember, he wasn't the successful artist yet that he later became. He was young, he was struggling. In all, Gabriel wrote 10 letters from number 5, which survive and are reprinted. Lizzie wrote some, which survive in the Janet Troxell collection at Princeton University in the States. And you see examples of both on the screen. Pre-Raphaelite expert Jan Marsh believes that Gabriel penned 2 poems while in Hastings, which could have been written in the house. So we're going up a notch in our reputation here. These are Sudden Light and Love's Nocturne, and they are both about ships, the sea, love, everything that happened in Hastings. Jan Marsh has written both the definitive books about Rossetti, because of course he was both painter and poet. So once again, the rich legacy of number 5 lives on. Lizzie eventually recovered sufficiently to be able to return to London in July 1854. She had been at number 5 for 10 weeks, and I like to think that she left Hastings with some happy memories, which sustained her for what was to come. Our last significant discovery concerning Hastings was that Lizzie returned there in April 1860. she again. Her relationship with Gabriel had waned, and there had been no offer of marriage in the 9 years they had now known each other, and Lizzie's reputation was so compromised that actually she couldn't move on. She was by now very ill and desperate. Her thoughts returned to those early days in Hastings, and once again she travelled to the town with the idea of recuperation. She probably sought out Mrs. Elphick because Mrs. Elphick had been rather like a mother to her, and was shocked to hear of John's death and then move away from number 5. She ended up in lodgings at 12 East Street, next door to the Cutter Inn. So I've only got a picture of the Cutter Inn. 5 High Street is there because Bessie Parks stayed there at one time, and they're all in a row along the seafront at Hastings. So she was prompted by the memory, I guess, that Gabriel had stayed at the Cutter and next door to the Cutter. It doesn't look very salubrious there. I hope it was better in those days. So she had gone back there. She was very ill, continued vomiting, and the landlady, another Mary Chatfield, stepped into the same role that Mary Elphick had had and nursed her. Mr. Chatfield, Alfred, a barber and a hairdresser, was actually so concerned about her that he wrote to her sister Lydia, and Lydia in turn contacted Gabriel. Now Gabriel and Lizzie hadn't actually seen each other in about 18 months, but Gabriel dropped everything and immediately travelled to Hastings to be with her. Gabriel arrived straight away. He was shocked by Lizzie's appearance and genuinely thought she was dying. Whether through guilt or pity, he was prompted to offer her marriage if she would get better. It would probably not have been love at this stage, but hopefully he felt some affection towards her. She accepted gratefully and began a very slow recovery. On the 23rd of May 1860, they were married at St Clement's Church, just down the road from High Street and just round the corner from 12 East Street, where she was staying. The witnesses were A. Chatfield and J. Chatfield. Now, Peter's and my final contribution to the Hastings part of the Gabriel-Lizzie story was our discovery of who the witnesses actually were. Previously, their names had been dismissed by Rossetti experts as being strangers or people off the street. Through our research, we were actually able to determine that they were Lizzie's present landlord, Alfred Chatfield, and his daughter, Jane, from 12 East Street. The Reverend Thomas Nightingale conducted the marriage. Mistakes were made on the marriage certificate, and Gabriel's father was recorded as Gabriel instead of Gabrielle. Lizzie's father was recorded as an optician rather than a cutler, not too much difference, and Dante was written down as Daniel. Lizzie finally got what she had craved for years. I need to draw this to an end very swiftly. Happiness eluded the Rossettis, though. By 1861, Lizzie was pregnant, but gave birth to a stillborn girl. From this point onwards, she gave up in life. She suffered severe natal depression, increased her take of laudanum. Laudanum had always been her crutch. It's an opiate. It's opium dissolved in alcohol, basically, and could be bought at the corner shop by children for their parents for a penny. In 1862, in February, Gabriel had gone out one night, and while he was out, Lizzie overdosed on it. Whether by accident or design, we will never know, but she was certainly incredibly depressed at the time. She was buried in Highgate Cemetery, in the Rossetti grave next to his parents in Pristina. And Gabriel buried his best book of poems with her in a macabre fit of whimsy. And he had Lizzie exhumed 7.5 years later in order to retrieve these poems, which he was obviously very fond of and thought were his best. So Lizzie was disturbed by him, even in death. Gabriel's artwork took off, and he became renowned for his large female figures, like that of Jane Morris at Kelmscott. This is Jane Morris, not the one at Kelmscott. This is Astarte Syriaca. Latterly, however, at the height of his success, he became a very haunted man. He couldn't sleep. He started taking chloral hydrate and drinking spirits, and descended into a deeply depressed state. Most of his friends deserted him, and he died at Birchington in Kent in 1882, where they'd hoped he would recuperate, aged only 54. He was a rich man who had changed the course of British art and left the world a stunning legacy of extraordinary paintings, but who ended his life a tormented soul, possibly never forgiving himself for his fine treatment of Lizzie. I've only had time to scratch the surface of the story here, and of the part played by 5 High Street and the part played by the house in their lives. I have a few remaining copies of my books, which I'm actually remaindering now, if you're at all interested. But now, the next part of the talk is going to be by Peter, and he will tell you, I've tried to fill in the sort of history and the details of people. He's going to tell you about the archaeology and the objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, this is the book by Violet Hunt, which is hugely revealing. When we got a copy, we could see why it was not taken seriously by scholars of the Pre-Raphaelites. But as we checked out the details, and there were descriptive details of the interior of the house, these checked out. So, and she did talk with people who were who knew of the stay of these 2 young people in Hastings. So her sources were good. This is the main page of information about the house, but it pops up in other parts of the book as well, with the picture of the house in the 1920s. The interior, you go through the front door into a dining room, and on the she described how, as you go through, there's a doorway on the right into the parlour used by the Elphics, which was our lounge. And then you go upstairs, and there are some bedrooms and a parlour for the visitors who stayed in the house. And one of the intriguing bits of her book was here. The staircase stopped at the next floor, that's upstairs, where the bedrooms were. Only 2 only, and access to it was through a door which was now shut as a rule, for it led to the attic, where no one slept now. It was haunted so badly in Mrs. Stainforth's time by an old man who no one ever saw, but whose footsteps followed one upstairs. Mrs. Stainforth, she must have been an earlier landlady, had to leave. All her and all her tenants had done the same. Mrs. Elphick said, until she enclosed the staircase in Stoothing, that's a kind of plasterwork, and kept the door to the foot of it closed. It was only left undone now when the man was mending the roof. This is the haunted staircase. Our bedroom turned out to be what was Lizzie's room. I'll come back to that. But here's the little haunted staircase, and the window at the end was not there then. But under the staircase, we found wallpaper that's in the other photograph, dating from about the 1790s. So we've got quite a lot of samples of wallpaper from the house from the 1790s right through to the 1950s, samples of which are all properly prepared. Well, I had to go through and try and reconstruct what the house was like at different times. And these are the plans here of downstairs and upstairs. And Elizabeth Siddal's room is this one here, which is the main bedroom. And fortunately, at the same time as 1854, a plan was made of the old town of Hastings, and this is the plan on the right-hand side. There's the house and the high street here, and there's the house. There's the garden with its little geometric paths and so on, with a cottage at the end here and a little passageway where a stream had been. We never saw or heard anything at all spooky in the house, but we were able to recognise Lizzie's room from two of the pictures that Gabriel Rossetti did. One of them, the one on the left, shows her with her hand on a windowsill, and on the other side there's her sitting down with the window at the back. Well, there's the window. It's the only window with a sill that you can put your hand on. And what was interesting is that because it's on the side of a valley, the high street's up there, but the next houses on the opposite side of the road are higher up. So anybody up there, and there's a pavement at the higher level, can look down and look straight into your bedroom. So we put up a net curtain, which is in the photo, and you see in the lower half of the window from Lizzie's time is a net curtain. And it may be sort of one of those things that sort of art historians would not notice, but there's a very good reason for the net curtain being there. But that was really quite intriguing. And yeah, there's part of finding wallpaper. That was in another room where just taking off the recent paint and recent paper, we got back to the Victorian surface and boarding behind, and Georgian boarding, and there was earlier wallpaper. Violet Hunt refers to the wallpaper, describes the wallpaper as flowers on a dun background in the house, and we found it and had a wallpaper expert look at this stuff, and yes, it's from the right time, and there it is. So things were checking out. It wasn't the only ghost, according to Violet Hunt, but the lady said she didn't in the least mind meeting a ghost. Well then, there was another, a woman who haunted the lean-to wash house or kitchen. It had been all three, but the people about here called it the corpse hole. Well, and the body, it was some woman had been laid out in there, and her body had been taken to the bottom of the garden and dumped into the stream and washed down into the sea. That's the story. Well, that became our kitchen, and we used to call it the corpse hole. Not when visitors came, but it was where it is. And outside was a lean-to little wash house, which we uncovered the foundations of it in excavation. Gant's map of 1851 and the Ordnance Survey map of 1873 shows the development of the garden, the cottages at the bottom against the high street, and the layout of the garden. So one of the things I wanted to do was to see if we could find the paths and flower beds and the garden toilet, which was actually, we did find there's a garden toilet there, which everybody was using until the 1860s, when the main sewage system was put in. And this is the brick path going down from the house, from the back door, and underneath was a gravel path which was there right from Georgian times, right through the time of Lizzie and Gabriel. The toilet, the remains of the toilet are just here, And we dug down in front here and under this part and found the brick lining of the cesspit underneath the brick toilet. And down in the garden we went through garden soil and through rubbish left by people and found that the property had started to be inhabited, judging from the rubbish pits and cesspits that were being dug, about 1600. So the records going back to the 1620s go back very nearly to the beginning of this property, the existence of this property. Prior to that, it was just open wasteland. Hastings was gradually growing back up the high street, and this is some way back from the sea, and so it's not in the main medieval part, though there are one or two medieval houses that were very close to number 5. So we dug up by the house, and there's the back of the house and the rubbish pits that are you can see in there. There's one very big one in there which dates from the late 17th to the mid-18th century. And that's actually Jenny having lunch one day, coming back from her work, and trying to get a bit of sunshine from being out inside an office, and she was very tolerant of being with an archaeologist because I completely messed up the garden. In fact, there wasn't a garden. And we had the Hastings Archaeological Society. They came and did the digging. They were absolutely fantastic. They really were, and put an enormous amount of work. And there's me doing the normal thing archaeologists do, drawing sections and so on. So, and it was nice. From the about 1750, there is a map of Hastings, the earliest map of Hastings. It has a little detail at one corner which shows, remarkably, the high street and just a group of houses. This is number 5. And the deeds show that number 5 was previously 2 little cottages in the 18th century. And on one summer's day, we opened it up, the garden, for visitors to come in. They didn't come through the house; they came through the gate in the bottom, the passage at the bottom of the garden. But it was very popular. Jenny washing an 18th century plate that's come out of a well. But that's the garden in 1750, with a stream at the bottom, and there's 2 little cottages. And we found traces of the cottages which have been demolished and replaced by the present house in the 1790s. Well, this is what we found from there was a Moore family, Mary Moore. Her husband had died. This is in the 1750s. When Mary Moore died, her daughters came along, and we have the deeds and documents to go with this, and wills, and found that they just went from the kitchen in one of the cottages and took crockery, kitchenware, tableware, this lovely delphine, and just dumped it into these pits. So they were lying there, stacked up, broken, and they were an awful job to get out, because some of the glaze was lifting off and taking the paint. We went through an enormous amount of going down to Boots and buying clear nail varnish. And when you go into Boots and ask for 10 bottles of clear nail varnish in your mail, people wonder what's up. But the real story is unbelievable. Anyway, so there are bottles, wine bottles, and it's just an amazing collection. And we have good reason to believe that the Moore family have been involved with smuggling with northern France. And one of the wonderful treasures from number 5 is this cockerel bowl. It's about this sort of diameter. We would have brought it if we could, but it's very rather fragile. From a place called Marsden. At least that's made. It's in Normandy, and the family had part ownership of a vessel. And at this time, tea and other things were very highly taxed, but the family was quite happily involved with, we're sure, getting money out of financing smuggling, which was rife in Hastings. It was the main source of money, apart from fishing at the time. And of course, we had some teapots from the 1750s and earlier, and Chinese porcelain. They weren't lacking, the Moore family weren't lacking for money, and more of the pottery that we dug up. But, now, of course, those of you who know Kelmscott will have seen Dante Gabriel Rossetti's palette of paint. It's one of the great treasures there. Well, we had jokes, well, will any of you find any of his paintbrushes in the garden? We didn't, but we found his toilet. And there it is. In the 1860s, when the main sewage system was put in, they dispensed with the old toilet bowl. They put a new one in, and they broke up the old one, which is this one here, and it's got Wedgwood. You can see Wedgwood on there, and it's in the Wedgwood patent books for around 1800. And it was smashed up, thrown back in the drain, the old the sewer pipe that had been put in. We found it, put the pieces together, and it's well, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Elizabeth Siddal used that. So with no paintings, no paintbrushes, but we've got the loo that they've used. I don't know that anybody else can claim that, perhaps Kelmscott. So there's the plaque, but it has a little plaque on there about George Wool. This is not the full story, and there's a lot more. The deeds from the 1620s to the present have a wonderful written legacy. George Wool had, in the 1820s, his repository of arts. He was a publisher of books and prints. That's another huge story, and a fascinating one, particularly as he went to America and ended up in St. Louis, and the deeds have his signature on for 5 High Street. Jenny was working in the courthouse in St. Louis, and in the room she worked in were documents with his signature on. And it's quite spooky, the whole thing. But anyway, that's an entirely other story. So there is a huge legacy of wonderful pictures that George Wool had published. We've got the letters and the pictures of Rossetti and the story of Elizabeth Siddal from the house. So we decided to add a little bit of ourselves to it. Jenny did the major thing of the story of, which is here, the book. Meanwhile, I was working on the Mary Rose, the academic publications. There's a whole series of volumes there. I was responsible for 2 of those. And so on the first one I had, which was published in, I think it's 2003, I had, in the introduction bit, Peter Marsden, 5 High Street added in, just my little contribution to number 5, but Jenny's is the main one. So there's just a very brief summary of what has been an amazing adventure into the past on what is, on the face of it, an ordinary little house, but it's got an extraordinary story, and it doesn't mention anything about the things that were going on in the 17th century and in the 18th century. And there are good stories there, like the town gunner and the sort of musket balls we were finding in the gun, and so on. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to us, and maybe we can answer questions if there are any.
Just 5 minutes to answer some questions, but 2 things strike me. First, how in some ways very comparable to Kelmscott Manor your property is, because the present building we know dates back at least until 1600 Kelmscott. And also that Kelmscott Manor has become so well associated with William Morris and Jane Morris and Rossetti. But of course, at Kelmscott Manor, it was already an ancient building when Morris leased it and lived there. And it was a very old building and a fantastic history that predated Morris's occupancy. and we want to start to explore that past as well as celebrating Morris's tenure there in the way that you've done. You did it in Hastings. And the other thing that strikes me is it just goes to show what you can find out about your own building, your own house. You know, I live in one built in 1953, but in my back garden is a 6th century, 7th century Saxon cemetery. So you never know what's actually just beneath you. Any questions?
Well, something very simple. Just who owns the house now? Is it someone who? Because you said you moved to Devon.
Yes, we have moved to Devon.
Yes.
And we sold it.
Yeah. Can you
speak to this one? Okay. We sold the house to a couple who had restored Georgian houses.
Oh.
That had been their interest, and they were extremely interested in the history. They loved the Rossetti connection. However, they took down our blue plaque on George Hall. So we were rather disappointed about that. They obviously wanted the main story to be the Rossetti connection. But they furnished the house in the style, in the Georgian style, and really looked after it. And it went to the right people.
Yes.
But they don't open it up like we do. Because we always used to be having the rest of the road in and tea parties and come and look at our latest treasures and so on. But each to his own. It's being well looked after.
Any more questions?
Rossetti was very very knowledgeable. Would he have known about Wall's connection to Hastings before he went there? Does that make sense?
Yes, answer yes.
I think he might well have, because I suspect Wall's books and lithographs still existed at the time, because there's only 30 years difference between them, and obviously other lithographers came along. But I suspect he found the guidebook very useful at the time that Wall actually wrote, called Stranger's Guide to Hastings.
Can I add to that? It was a repository of arts. So when any artists, it was popular with artists in the first half of the 19th century. And this is where they got their supplies and where the links with London and so on, Ackerman's repository here. And one of the artists who came was Turner. So there's little doubt that he got his supplies, things and contacts through the house, but there's no documentation on that. But yes.
Anybody else? At the back.
Do I wait for that? Can everybody hear me? Got that sort of voice. Thank you. Very quickly, and for anybody else who's looking to look at the deeds of their house, be warned, you'll be told by your solicitor that they are now all electronically kept, and you really don't need to keep them. And I spent a lot of time in the solicitor's office tearing up old deeds. Be warned.
It's a great tragedy. The whole archive is to be preserved in a museum, and the oldest deeds are actually with Hastings Museum, but we've given the deeds and the finds and the archaeological records and historical records to a trust, but we would like it to be kept in Hastings. When we offered it all to Hastings Museum, sadly it was turned down because they hadn't got space. So we actually do have a problem, because we weren't expecting all this massive documentation or this massive find. We had more objects from this one garden than Hastings Museum has had from the entire Hastings. And you just don't normally find piles of crockery and cups and things just dumped en masse. And it is house clearance, yes.
No, but solicitors, they've given up keeping deeds at offices because, like Hastings Museum, it's just too much. And suburban solicitors will say, that's all right, you don't need them. Because quite often there'd be a pack of deeds going back.
Yeah.
because they're all electronically stored now.
Mm.
And I honestly spent time tearing up
Oh, what
these.
a tragedy, yes. One
I
hears
just
about.
didn't want them.
Actually, our solicitors told us that at our house, not in 1953, but we kept them. So, it's very interesting just for us to see the evolution of our humble abode. Any more questions? One last one.
I just wondered why nobody replaced the white boarding on the front of the house, taking it off, because it looked so odd. Nobody thought of doing that? Is there a reason for that?
I think it's because nobody knows what's behind. It's attached to the timber framework, and it's the cost of it all as well. I think you're ending up with problems. I remember one day coming into the bedroom, and there was Jenny talking to Death Watch Beatles. And she was tapping them at a certain time of the year. They're looking for a mate, and they're sort of clicking away, tap, tap, tap. And there was Jenny doing the tap, 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 and they stopped. They were listening to her, and then they excitedly started clicking away or tapping away behind the boarding. And it was an amazing memory of mine, just going to Jenny talking with these things. These creatures are there, you can't eradicate them, but obviously if one could take boarding off, you could sort of treat them. But it is, but you're opening up a huge hornet's nest of cost and unknowns, and so it's a listed building. That boarding is there. It was put before it was listed, and I suppose it was.
We often used to wonder how the house stood up, because there was a beam in the dining hall which was underneath Lizzie's room, and that beam sagged. And actually Lizzie's room had been raised, the floor had been raised not once but twice, in order not to have to put an RSJ, an ugly RSJ, underneath in the dining hall, but to preserve the lovely wooden beam that was there, that was quite rough hewn actually, so you could see it started life as a tree. And in the lounge we used to have another tree that propped up, another sagging beam. So, and it was slung. It was a fairly reasonably built house, I suppose, reasonably costing. Can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Reasonably costed house in that it didn't have walls of its own. It was slung between two much grounder walls. And when we started chipping away at one time in our kitchen, we ended up in next door's cellar.
I'm sure you'll like
Full of surprises.
Okay, bring it to a close at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you to Jenny for a fascinating lecture that just encapsulates what just fantastic research and scholarship. It helps if you're an archaeologist and historian, of course. But it just goes to show what you can find out about your building or your locality if you